Yeah, I think CMS is in a little bit of a crisis with the teacher situation. If you look, North Carolina lost, I think, 8% of teachers last year, and we were almost double that here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg County. My mother is one of those subs who gets called daily to fill in the gaps right now. So one of the things they can't do immediately is adjust teacher pay, which I know they tried to get more. So that's got to be a longer term play with the county and the state, maybe shorter term with the county for sure. Things they could do now is actually figure out what is causing the dissatisfaction amongst teachers. And one of the things I don't think our past superintendents and their leadership has done is really listen to their staff well enough. And what I mean by that is actually hold sessions, surveys, and do things to understand why they're dissatisfied. There's actually a survey done every 2 years called the North Carolina Teachers Working Conditions Survey. I think almost 70% of CMS teachers fill it out. And so you could go on there, it's a public survey right now, and it'll show you how over the past few years there's some glaring trends in what's happening and why teachers are dissatisfied. And there's some major things around not enough, non-instructional time to plan and additional duties and paperwork. There are things like they don't feel like they're getting the professional development. They feel like they're getting micromanaged through curriculum. So these are all areas that are within the board's control to go in and say, how are we allocating investments in technology to potentially relieve some of these overworking and extra hours teachers are having to put in? How do we secure professional development, and what are our processes with HR to make sure they're giving feedback and also getting reviews? So I think there are things that if they just dig in and actually speak to the teachers and get data on it, they could start to improve the satisfaction scores amongst them. Pay's not everything. It does matter to have a livable wage here in Charlotte, by the way, for teachers, so I will totally fight for better wages, but there's a lot of other things they could be doing right now. Yeah, I think the challenge right now is there is not a good culture set from the top down. Everything is, and this goes back to having a leadership issue, right? And leadership sets the tone for everything. And I say this as I am an executive leader in a business. We set the tone for everything. And the strategy and the culture we work to create. Culture doesn't just exist. You create it and you live it. Hasn't happened. There's been 7 superintendents in the past 10 years. So there's been a menagerie of like what culture is going to be and what the strategy is going to be. And so what ends up happening is culture is honestly created, I think, in the individual school level right now, right? But also they're not getting the support they need from above. So when I talk to teachers, because I sit on the student improvement plan team within our schools, it feels like they're on an island. They're not hearing from the leadership, they're not being developed, they're not cross-collaborating across schools. And I say this as my kid's school is a tremendously successful school, but they don't feel like they're getting the attention, they're not being heard, they're not being developed. So it's one of these things, I think the principles that create strong cultures, you see them retain teachers better than the ones where they don't. And sometimes that has to do with the parental involvement as well. So, yes, so I think as someone who hires and builds teams, you have to be very transparent about what the person is stepping into when it comes from the role. At the same time, the board is overseeing the superintendent, right? So the makeup of that board and their professional experience and their direction matters as well. So I don't necessarily think it's been the wrong superintendent every time. I think there's a combination of it's the wrong board members too who are also overseeing and advising them. With that being said, I think some of the past ones especially, they picked someone who wasn't quite ready for the role. Again, CMS is a very large organization. It is not like turning 1 or 2 schools around. It's moving a cruise ship, right? You can turn a speedboat much faster than you can turn a cruise ship. So you need someone who has had that type of experience, because it's not the same thing as fixing 1 or 2 where you can get in those schools individually and actually figure out what's going on. You got to know how to build your team. You've got to have a respectable team. So the superintendent has to be really good at building the right infrastructure and team. that functions in a large organization. And I honestly think we've picked people who've been tremendous educators, especially on a lower level. But when they jump to that large organization, they get lost on how do you actually impact the entire system. They know how to do it on a small scale, but doing that on a large scale is a very different skill set than you will see. And it's a difference between working in a startup as a CEO and working in one that has, 1,000 locations. Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet, by the way, in any interview. And I say this as someone who interviews people constantly. So I would never say, yep, that's the person who's going to do this from one single question. I will probably have 10 to 20 myself individually. But I think the thing that matters the most to me is there's a lot of public information on CMS out there, right? School board meetings, all of that. My biggest thing for them is to give me the assessment on what they can do in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and what their plan is to go about doing that. Also, the second biggest thing is I would want to understand the type of culture that they want to build for our teachers as well as our kids, because that's what matters. The school system exists to improve student outcomes, and you cannot do that without tremendous teachers. So if they are not focused on both of those, they're not the right candidate for me. Yeah, it's funny you said this because I literally was having this conversation with moms of elementary school kids last night. And it's one of those things that partially goes back to me talking about the need for communication and transparency. So a lot of people don't understand when they hear those things that proficiency means like a final score, right? And that there's also the secondary score where your kid's benchmarked, and then there's where they went to. So I firmly believe, I know today that schools are judged heavily on what that end score is. I think it's 80% of the equation, and only 20% is the growth you make. And I say this as someone who manages people for a living. I will take someone who can move someone on a bigger growth trajectory than I will have if someone just constantly has people scoring at the top. The reality is you get a different set of kids that walk in on day one every year for a teacher, right? And to judge them based on the outcome at the very end and the top score, I don't think is fair. That's not to say that we don't have a lot of room to improve, but for me, the focus of success is how well you took them from the beginning to the end on that growth trajectory. And I will say, when you look at the scores, our school's actually far much better when you look at it that way. So we have a lot of room to go, and I say that as my kid just finished third grade last year and was part of those scores that everyone is, screaming about. And I will say there's a lot of room for growth there, but the reality is I think the public as well as parents need to understand what the difference in proficiency and growth is too. And I think as a parent, you get that, right? Because you're talking to the teacher. So when they're all like, we're freaking out because the test score is this, it's like, well, your kid actually started here. So we made a 50-point jump. That's a big deal. So that's where I think working with the teachers and trusting them and giving them and holding them accountable there is more important than what that overall test score is in the end. We've got to work toward it, but that's a systematic thing that we have to work towards. You can't individually judge a teacher based on what walks in on day one and if they just scored very, very high, because they may not have been given a class that was ever going to do that. Yes, no, and I think as a parent, all you want for your kid is the best, right? So, and I have friends whose kids are in private school and charter school. I actually get asked most of the time what private school my kids go to because I'm a corporate executive and I have to correct them that my kids are in public school. And the reality is public school, you don't get to pick and choose. Charter schools, you do. So I would want to look at the data to understand, even with the Black and brown students, they tend to cherry pick the better performing ones because a lot of them actually have screenings they do before you can actually get into the school. So I don't think it's a fair assessment without truly looking at the data. When you can cherry pick the group that's coming into your school, you can score better. I can do that in the corporate world too, by the way. So that's how you manipulate data. The reality with public school is they're there also to pick up things when the charter schools fail. And we know overall the charter schools actually scored under CMS. And I think a lot of people want to justify their decisions of why they move their kids to private and charter schools and it's for the better, when the reality is they can get a tremendous education in CMS too, right? So they're not apples and oranges. Sometimes it's just how you cut the data, to be perfectly frank. So the one thing I do have concern over is when we look at how North Carolina has continued to underfund public education in North Carolina, and charter schools and private schools are pulling funds away, it makes it even harder for CMS to be successful. And they have strict guidelines that the state and then the school board actually helps dictate, right, within CMS, where the others don't. And that's very concerning because you get tremendous charter schools and you're gonna get schools that completely fail kids. And so that's the difference is, you're rolling the dice there. Here, while there's tremendous room to improve in CMS, the reality is it's governed. It should be successful for kids, right? Where the charter schools, you don't know because there's zero oversight. And I will say, as we've continued to pull funds away, it's always going to be harder to do better with less. Not to say that we can't, but they tend to siphon away investments that we need to make in all the kids here in the county while they go and actually cherry pick who's in their schools. Living in today's world as a parent, it's a little terrifying, partially because safety isn't just a school safety issue. Like there is a gun epidemic in this country, and I say this as someone who grew up in the South and we own guns. It's kind of scary how many guns are out there in America. And it is actually a community issue, I think, that we need to make our schools safer. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the pressure has been put on the schools, as it does with everything, to fix community problems. That being said, I think the body scanners were actually the right call. And I think it has also, put a warning in place, which is why we're seeing a lot less. I think the clear backpacks were obviously a mistake and knee-jerk reaction, especially when you look at the investment made there. But I think the other things that we can do to go further with school safety is really invest in staff to support our students, right? So the past few years have been overwhelming as parents, and it's been projected on our kids, regardless of what you say. It's been projected because they can't really comprehend, especially on an elementary level, what has gone on in the world. So we all need additional support, especially socially and emotionally, and I think our kids do as well. And so when you have more staff that's able to address all of our students' needs, it becomes a safer environment for all. So while I think they've made some of the right safety protocols with body scanners and making sure there's less entrances for outside visitors, and I think all that needs to continue to be improved and optimized and evaluated, I think we also have to invest in more staff outside of teachers who are doing instructional to make sure that we're fully supporting our students. Yeah, I think this is where the school board's going to have to partner with city council as well as county commission, right? So if you think about there's definitely law enforcement, but that's not going to solve everything, right? It's the investment in, mental health and different programs throughout the county to support the community's needs. So this is where it's not just a school board issue. This is where the school board's really going to need to reach out to the leadership amongst the community. So that being the city council and the county commission, but also I think one of the things we have to do is get the community more engaged. And I don't mean just set up a few forums. I think we have to get in the community and figure out what's happening and see how we can work together and what programs we can build throughout the county, throughout different organizations, throughout the school board. So I think this is where this is a community issue. If we truly want to solve it, one of us isn't going to figure it out ourselves. This is where we're all going to have to get together, and for the sake of all of our kids and honestly all of the residents of Mecklenburg County, work to figure out how to make it safer.